And think about it with your team. If you spend most of your time reporting on numbers, then most of your stakeholders speak that language. Uplift, decrease, revenue, stakeholders speak that language very clearly and very plainly. What they maybe don't speak as well as you is what happened, how do you interpret those results? So what do we learn and where do we go next is the important part of the test.
Hey Experiment Nation, it's Tracy Laranjo. You are going to love today's episode with Simon Girardin. He's a CRO manager at Conversion Advocates, and you may recognize him from his thought-provoking posts on LinkedIn. In this episode, we're going to talk about something that every experimenter absolutely must know, which is how to learn from past tests. Then we'll go into the roadblocks that get in the way of iterative testing, and then what you can do before an experiment even goes live to ensure that the learnings will be valuable. Thank you so much for listening, and let's get right into it. Hey Experiment Nation, it is your hostess with the mostest, Tracy Laranjo, and I'm back here with another episode with someone who I love. I love their content. It's always so relevant. It's so clear. I'm so excited to have them on the show. On the show today is Simon Girardin from Conversion Advocates. And today we're going to be talking a lot about how to learn from past tests. And I think Simon's the perfect person to talk about this. So Simon, welcome to the show.
Hi, Tracy. I'm so happy to be here. We've got a lot to talk about. And I'm, as you said, I'm CRO Program Manager over at Conversion Advocates. I am a huge advocate of testing strategically, having an intent and purpose behind what we do, and being customer focused, which means running research and basing every experiment based on some customer or market research insights. And that's the best way to generate ROI from your CRO programs. That's the best way to capture learnings as well, which is our topic for today. I'm really excited to dive into this topic because everyone talks about you should learn from your tests. And everyone talks about you should run research in your testing program. But the topic of how do you actually learn from the test itself is not as much talked about. So I'm really excited to dive into it.
Totally. I think it's so easy for people to just talk about how to get to a test, how to interpret your test, but then it kind of stops from there to the point where as a new optimizer, you may be left thinking, okay, well, what do I do from here? What next? So definitely want to talk to you about this because I think you've written a lot of great content about this on LinkedIn. And I guess my first big question for you, and something that a lot of newer optimizers might be thinking as well, is why is it so important to learn from past test results instead of just moving on to the next thing?
Yeah, for sure. And just kind of to preface this, the feedback that I'm getting in the industry is there's like two different degrees of, first, some people are aware that, yeah, we need to learn from tests. Fewer people are even aware of how do we do it and what's the first step, what's the output of it. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's such a fascinating topic. And the core reason why it's important is multifold. So on one end, when you build a first experiment and you create a follow-up iterations and variations, what it means is you gain efficiency over time, because if you build a content block, for example, and then you want to iterate on the content itself, most of the hard work is done on the first attempt. So every further experiment is much more efficient for your full tech team. So that means you're getting much more bang for your bucks, whether you're in-house or with an agency. So that's one thing. You also gain insights from every single test that you run. So if you say on average a team spends maybe around 6 hours working on a test, from test plan all the way to calling it and doing results, and if you only spend a couple minutes reviewing it, where are you capturing the value from the test itself? So that's where I take really importance with this step, where you should sit down and focus and mute every distraction that exists. Just kind of like think about your tests and look at the results. And there's a lot of stuff that you need to do to be able to capture and create all that value for the organization. And first thing is, when you're looking at the data, you need strong analytics to be able to look at, the metrics, their uplifts, decrease. You should never report on a metric that has 82% probability to be best or statistical significance. You never do that. It's a flat result and we don't go further about it. But everything that's stat sig and everything that is not, you should segment as well. So maybe for your mobile visitors, or maybe you have a different segment. And sometimes it's also a cohort. Mobile and new visitors together have very interesting behaviors that's different from what you see. So you want to spot these different trends and try to understand what happened for these people. Mm-hmm. You also want to go into your UX research. So, okay, I've run a test. we've spent multiple hours setting it up, running it. Now I've got some results that I know what happened, and you should spend some time looking at session recordings and heat maps. Maybe it's nothing to gain, but maybe you'll see something that's appears directly to your eyes, and you know what, you take action from it.
Totally.
So there's the analytics part, and then there's the kind of UX research, post-test UX research. You shouldn't spend multiple hours on that, but just kind of a quick health check. Hey, I have an intuition to look at this or that, or mobile was really interesting. Let's look at a couple session recordings. So those things are important, because then you get like a full understanding of what happens on this page and how do our users behave there. And then you just kind of started the process. Next is you have to interpret that data. This is the fuzzy part, because like getting the data can be challenging. If you don't have a data scientist, it's going to be challenging. I really recommend you work with an expert data scientist. I'm the type of person as a program manager who asks questions. What about this? What about that? Can you tell me if this type of user had a behavior similar to what I'm expecting? I'm not able to pull that data, so I have someone helping me. So then when you have all that, you need to interpret the data. This stage is basically just trying to put into words what you're seeing, what happened, why, is that what I expected? And what's important is that you don't need to tell the truth here. Like, you don't need to own it, is what I mean. You can just say, I have an hypothesis, or my suspicion is that, or perhaps this specific behavior happened because of a reason. Tie it to your research and tie it to why you built this experiment. You have an hypothesis that basically is a solution to a problem you've identified. So when you take all of this together, you create a very intentional process of taking the initial data points, taking some follow-up extra data, and then creating a very rich explanation of what happened and what we've observed. So even if you have an inconclusive test or a losing test, then suddenly the value is completely different, because your team doesn't only see uplifts and revenue.
100%. And you just spoke to something that I think every optimizer encounters, which is you look at a result and the numbers show you, okay, it was a loss, but just going into your test and approaching it with a learning mindset, it's never a loss if you actually learn something that's going to take you to the next step, or that is forming the narrative that will lead you to that big learning and that big win.
This is Romo Santiago from Experimentation. Every week we share interviews with and conference sessions by our favorite conversion rate optimizers from around the world. So if you like this video, smash that like button and consider subscribing. It helps us a bunch. Now back to the episode.
Do you ever find that clients will push back on iterating on a test and they just want to move on to the next big thing?
For sure that happens. And you just touched on test losses. One thing that's important as you're going through that process, and I do that on a call with my clients because the feeling of having this conversation in real time, I feel adds a lot of value. I'm able to gauge them and understand every stakeholder, where they stand at, and if they seem disengaged or super engaged with what we're talking about. Something important is every test loss specifically is that you've prevented something that if you were to just ship on production would have hurt the site. So it's important to articulate that. So if you have this aspect of, hey, we've prevented a loss, and then here's what we learned, and we've discovered some sort of behaviors and trends that are interesting, then multiple things can happen. Is one, I like to say what we did is we shifted customers in a certain direction and we created a loss. If we're able to do a 180 degree, maybe the next test is going to be a win, but now we've built some learnings and we've understood that we touched on a lever just on the wrong side of it. So if we were to just flip it, maybe this time it's going to be a win. So for sure, there's some sort of pushback, but how you approach the losing result before you even kind of let your stakeholders chime in, I think has a real impact on how they perceive it and how much of their attention is going to be spent on, oh God, we lost versus, oh, okay, there's some follow-up potential here. And this was a valuable experiment.
Absolutely. Do you find that when you go through this process of iterating that there's a certain number of iterations and once you reach that point, you say, okay, it's time to abandon this and move on? Like what is kind of your judgment criteria for knowing when it is time to stop iterating on one specific hypothesis?
That is a great question. And I will say it is an intentional process, but I don't think there's a clear guideline or guardrail that would apply to every single experiment. So there's a couple of things that come into this conversation of one, how highly prioritized is this hypothesis? every quarter, you should be looking back at your testing metrics and maybe you reprioritize things. I don't think every team does that, and they should. Specifically, one of our criteria on our prio matrix is, are we testing against the key KPI of this quarter? Every quarter, we pick one key metric that we try to increase, because that allows us to focus on it and make sure that we gain traction. But every quarter, you might pivot. So maybe this test was good for the last quarter, but now we want to pivot to something else. So first, is it still highly prioritized? If yes, then let's keep looking at it. Second, is every follow-up iteration still teaching us something new? Or are we kind of suddenly stuck in a rut? We're shipping tests and like there's no follow-up actionable stuff that happens. No segments that are interesting, no traction that's posted anywhere. Previously, I said you should never report on a metric that has 82% probability to be best. But don't disregard it either. Like there's a traction that you're seeing here. If you're able to increase the effect of what you're causing here, maybe suddenly the next variant is a statistically significant result. So it's important that you take all of that into account. But when there's no more learnings, there's no more interesting data points from your segmentation and results analysis, then you're starting to get into a moot point, and the efficiency is not even worth it anymore. Another thing is, have we discovered new issues through research that are suddenly more important or more pressing? If so, then maybe it warrants a pivot. So it really is an intentional process more than a clear guideline and like SOP that you could use in your business. But it's just important to ask questions before you actually make your own mind, I would say.
Totally. Absolutely. And it also opens up the opportunity for totally different hypotheses too. Like you don't have to just keep iterating on the same one. And that is a huge value add that I've seen with this approach. Did you want to add anything there?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's like 2 degrees that you can look at every single test with your teams. Is one, do we align on the hypothesis? And second, do we align on the variation? And I think that this is it's misregarded often. But the difference is, an hypothesis is there's an issue, here's what we think is going to solve it. Whereas the variations are all the various ways that you can solve the problem. So what's important is that you can iterate on the hypothesis, you can iterate on the variations. And so sometimes you might be testing against the same hypothesis for 6 months, but you've pivoted multiple times in terms of what you do in the variation on its treatment. That's important because if ever, and I'm going to kind of do a parallel topic here, if ever you encounter pushback with test plan presentations and kind of getting approvals, one thing that's really great as an advice is go to these 2 different levels and check where there's a lack of agreement and alignment with your teams. If it's on the hypothesis, that either the problem is not important to your stakeholders, or either your proposed solution doesn't sit with them. That's a great point for you to start a conversation, think critically, and then kind of find where's the middle ground or where should we go next, because maybe you just need to disregard where you were into. But then if you're going to the second level of, well, we disagree on the variation, then you can work with your teams to actually build up what it would look like so that everyone is on board and happy with it.
Totally.
Sorry for this quick pivot, but I thought it was
it's so relevant because you can end up with a result and it might have nothing to do with your hypothesis being wrong. It's just that the treatment or the approach to it was not correct. So I think it is really important to call that out, because it doesn't necessarily mean you need to throw your hypothesis out. You just need to change the way you approached testing it.
And something that Jeremy Epperson says often is sometimes, you might have the right data points, the correct hypothesis, and only be slightly off in your implementation, and you don't find a win here. But if you abandon your test there, then you were that close to actually finding a winner. So it's a lot of setting up your own right mental models and going into this journey of optimization, and not just like kind of one quick shot and it's a score.
Totally. And
most sport teams, have multiple touch points before either the ball or the puck, if you're in hockey, goes through the net. There's multiple players who are going to touch it and they're going to interact, and they're going to have these multiple, not only touch points, but, sophisticated strategies. And so you need to think of your experimentation the same way. Maybe you need to do a couple passes before it gets to score a goal.
Totally. And you really made it easy for me to segue into this big question that I have. It's the question that I always come across when I'm starting an experiment. And it's, what is the one thing that I need to do today before this experiment even gets executed on, before I even start designing it? What do I need to do today to make sure that when I look at this report at the end, I'm not scratching my head saying, did I actually learn anything from this? What would you say is the thing?
It's not the thing. It's actually an intentional process and you need to have in place with multiple things. So this process is actually sitting down, and when you create your test plan, what's most commonly known in our field and industry is, you have like this URL targeting, audience targeting, you have like the traffic split and all these kind of technical assignments that you're going to set up in the test plan. If you stop there, you're just getting a test shipped. That's not really how you're going to learn from it. So the first thing is go back to your research, and basically when you're testing, ideally you have multiple research methods that all point to one same user issue that you want to solve. So then go back to your hypothesis and think, so based on all these insights that I'm getting from research, I see this issue and I am trying to provide that solution to solve it. It's super important that you intentionalize this process and be very purposeful when you're thinking about it. So next, what you want to think is, what I'm doing is I am creating an experiment that's going to help us decide if that is a right solution or not. So kind of go back to the actual purpose of CRO and experimentation is making business decisions that are accurate and effective. So when you go back to all of these points, you also can think of what is the desired or expected outcome. So you should not, try and traffic any sort of settings of your experiment to achieve those results. But it's important that you think of them specifically. If what you're doing is shipping a new feature and you expect it or hope that it doesn't suppress conversions from a different action on your site, then your expectation going into the test results is that if you find flat decreases and increases, then it's a good thing because you haven't suppressed anything. But if you were just going into the experiment, haven't had the intentional thought, you might just call this inconclusive and move on. Well, in reality, you confirm that you created no harm. So this is an important part of the process, but it's just based on how you call the test. So when you actually get into the results and you analyze the segments, you can think back to your research and say, there were this and that point of customer insights or market research insights that pointed to this solution. And so if you were to draw, some sort of a chart and you had a bunch of lines that were kind of meeting at a certain point where you have your problem and hypothesis, then your intent following that and going into your test results is you're trying to see if you followed up in a direction that was intended or not. And having this process takes time. That's why I'm saying, if your team spent something like 6 hours working on a test, you should sit down and spend as much time as you need to, formalize all of this, write it down, and making it, formal, and share it to your teams. Mm-hmm. I said a lot of stuff. Did I lose you? And
I want to actually dive a bit deeper into that. When you are in the process of looking at test results with your team, what does that look like? Does it look like a call that you set up, or is this just separate analyses going on? Really paint that picture for me.
It's a multi-step process, to be honest. The first part is, statistical analysis and just kind of results reporting. So we make sure we report on all the key metrics, and we'll also look at some core segments that are usually relevant for our clients. One team we're working with, we're always looking at new versus returning visitors as the most important differentiation for their site. Others are like, they have 75% of their audience using a mobile phone. So mobile is always a segment that we look into before almost anything else. Mm-hmm. So that's the first part. There's CRO analysts who work on creating all those reporting dashboards and reports. Then the CRO Program Manager, which role I am in too, will kind of go in and try and look at these results and formulate a recommendation and kind of, what have we learned? What are the next steps? What we also do is once a week, our team meets with everyone, designers, developers, CRO people, and then we look at these results and we try to answer these questions of like, are we surprised with these results? Where do we go next? Do you see any variations that we could follow up this with? It's important that you include all of these people with various backgrounds. Super important. If you have some stakeholders who are executive level or director level, invite them as well, because everyone has a unique perspective and their baggage is not the same as yours. And it adds a lot of sophistication and it bridges gaps and blind spots that everyone has. And so when you regroup this team together, what I like to say is we turn one test result into 10 new hypotheses or variations. So that creates a kind of exponential effect and value for the client team, but also for our own internal team, as everyone is maybe challenged or is asked questions that maybe have not been thought of. And so it's a multi-stage process. And let me wrap this up by quoting Manuel da Costa, who I really love when he says, you should never grade your own homework. And so doing this exercise as a team ensures that your effort and your when you discuss this back with your team and stakeholders, you have reliable results that are trustworthy. And that is important because we're basing important business decisions on that.
Yeah. And also, any result in which you learn something isn't a bad result. It's always a good result if you've learned something and if you've mitigated some sort of risk.
Absolutely. And so,
love it.
Not part of our process of calling tests, but afterwards, there's a formal process of presenting the results. And we do that over, it's a long process. If we're on a call, we might spend 5 to 10 to 15 minutes on a single test. And the reason for that is we report on the numbers and think about it with your team. If you spend most of your time reporting on numbers, then most of your stakeholders speak that language. Uplift, decrease, revenue. Stakeholders speak that language very clearly and very plainly. What they maybe don't speak as well as you is what happened, how do you interpret those results? So what do we learn and where do we go next is the important part of the test. And so the numerical values we report on rather quickly. Hey, we've seen this and that shift. By the way, there was that segment that was super interesting and that monitoring metric was completely off the books and we didn't expect that. Mm-hmm. Let me just kind of make a segment here. You should have multiple layers of metrics, your primary KPI that you're trying to directly affect. You should have secondary KPIs, which are important metrics, just not the one that you're focusing on. You should have a bunch of monitoring stuff. So like CTA clicks, page views, and all these kind of engagement metrics like bounce rate, revisit rate, time on page. Like none of these should be your primary component for what you call a test for, but they all are important and you need to look at this holistically. Mm-hmm. And so when we're with the client team, we don't spend that much time on all of these things, but we'll report on all the stuff that we found interesting. But
I love that you brought up. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, sorry. Go on ahead. I'm just like, I love talking about metrics.
Yeah. And so the next step is we visually create a full slide on what have we actually learned from this test. And we'll spend time kind of sharing our interpretation. And as I said before, you don't need to own a truth here. You just need to say, maybe there's a follow-up hypothesis. Maybe we have unanswered questions. This test made us realize that we have more questions to answer. That's super exciting. And it changes how stakeholders see the test because as soon as you do that, it stops being a finite game and it becomes infinite.
Yeah.
And so really what have we learned? User behavior shifts, expectations that were met or unmet, things that we validated or invalidated. It's also important that you formalize what is the test outcome and also what's the recommendation. Maybe it's a test win, but you don't recommend an implementation for some reason. Or maybe, I just had a test last week where we found a winner for the mobile segment specifically. But for this client, we don't really have a differentiated experience on both device types. So before we go and implement that and create a tech debt, we actually want to do more variations. We're able to see, is that something that will monitor a trend over time with multiple tests? Or was that a one-off? Because it will really inform if we want to implement that win to production. So that process is important of what's the outcome and what is the recommendation next. And it's totally okay to say this test is a win. We should maintain control for now and do more iterations, but let's keep it in our back pocket. It was really good.
Yeah. Okay. You said something there. I promise this is going to be my last question about the topic. And so there are situations in which you actually do have technically a win, but it's within one segment and you choose not to actually implement. Is that because, you want to keep the experience consistent between devices and then you keep testing until you find that treatment that's going to be significant on all devices? Can you talk a bit more about that? Yeah. What happens if you encounter that situation?
So with segmentation, the biggest risk that you run into, and we rarely run segmented tests when we start a CRO program, to be clear. We generally start testing globally and we'll only test against segments when we have validation. Mm-hmm. So for example, if we had 5, 6 different experiments that all pointed towards mobile and desktop performing opposite ways, then we'll start designing experiments specifically for a device type. But before that, the danger with segmentation is that if you found a win for a specific segment and you go to implement that, then your experience is differentiated on desktop and mobile. That's not the issue. The issue is that in the backend of the site, you have differentiated experiences, you have a larger code base. Now you have a bunch of challenges for the engineering team to manage. And the more that you test, the more you segment. If you start doing that really frequently, the engineering team is going to be really confused, and it's going to be challenging to upkeep all the site. Yeah. So that's why we might hold off on an implementation of production and wait that we get multiple validating experiments that tell us, okay, we need to go that route. Back to the core purpose of experimentation, we're trying to gather data to make efficient decisions for the business. So if you just call a win, implement it live, and then created a tech debt, maybe that's not even an efficient decision.
Totally. I'm so glad you said that. It's easy to get wrapped up in the dopamine hit you get of encountering a win, and then in the long term, it's actually not really a win if the rest of the team who's responsible for implementing it is now stuck in this tech debt situation where they have to manage all these inconsistencies. And I'm so glad you mentioned that. You said so much that's so helpful, I think, to anyone who encounters these very specific situations after a test wraps up. I'm not new to this, but I still learned things. So I really appreciate that, Simon. Thank you so much. I have one big question for you. It's going to be really difficult. Who should we interview next?
Oh, wow. That is a great question. Well, if you want to stay exactly on the topic, I can't recommend enough Shiva, who's always talking about testing the learn. That would be really, really relevant. But otherwise, I would recommend maybe talking with Manuel da Costa. I just had a conversation with him last week, and it was super insightful because we talked about should you have exec level buy-in into your program, and what happens if you don't. And we're both of the school of thought that you actually need the exec level buy-in. You need the desire and interest into experimentation to come from the top level leadership if you want it to be a success for the organization.
Totally. That's totally a good topic. So we'll definitely reach out to Manuel. Also, Shiva's Shiva's a good friend of mine. So I'm just going to give him a nice nudge that he was mentioned here. So thank you.
For sure. Wink, Shiva.
Yeah. Hey, Shiva, I know you're watching this. You better be watching this. And then I guess lastly, do you have anything going on that you want our listeners to know about and check out?
Not necessarily. You can follow me on LinkedIn. I post content there every day. My kind of direction and purpose there is sharing stuff about how to actually test strategically. All the kind of topics that we've talked about, I post about them. I share also case studies and stories of what happened in the day-to-day work. I'm really excited about working with multiple stakeholders, and I'm also really passionate about the challenges that these teams of, fast growth startups experience, and helping them kind of grow through these rapid pace, and also kind of chime in experimentation into their growth process as the entire organization. I'm super passionate about all of that. So just follow me on LinkedIn, and that's all.
I second that. Do follow Simon on LinkedIn. So thank you so much, Simon, for speaking with us today. And thank you to our listeners for listening. I hope you learned a lot. I did. And I'm going to keep following your content. I always love it. So thank you so much, Simon. And I hope you have a great rest of your journey in experimentation.
Thank you, Tracy. It was great. And thanks to Experimentation. I'm always happy to be on this podcast and share knowledge with everyone.
Happy to have you.
This is Romo Santiago from Experimentation. Every week, we share interviews with and conference sessions by our favorite conversion rate optimizers from around the world. So if you like this video, smash that like button and consider subscribing. It helps us a bunch.